Hello, I am Carolyn Eady, the Ag Educator for Crawford and Richland counties. Lissa Seafeld, the Ag Educator in Eau Claire County, Bernie O'Rourke, the Youth Livestock Extension Specialist, and Todd Taylor, the Arlington Sheep Unit Research Program Manager, helps with our series. Please feel free to reach out to us in the chat or by email if you have any questions or comments. We are glad you could join us. Please remember the most essential Zoom functions, your microphone and your video. They are at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and the chat box is located at the bottom middle of your screen. Please leave your microphones muted during the webinar, and there will be time at the end of the presentation to ask questions. Please ensure that your video is off, and this will help with our bandwidth. Place any questions or comments in the chat box, and we will be reading them as we go, and we will be stopping our presenter to ask them as we go along. And then we will also have time for question and answers at the end. Before we get started, we have a poll to learn about you, the producer. Great, we have a lot of information coming in, and we'll wrap that up in another 30 seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. My slides are advancing quickly. So tonight we have with us a guest from Penn State University. That's Dr. Van Saun from Penn State, and he will be discussing the nutrient requirements of our gestating females before they go into lactation and during lactation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the controls over to you.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Glad to have you here for this program tonight. Hopefully, we'll cover some important questions you may have in dealing with pregnancy toxemia and colostrum in our small ruminants. I'm going to focus a bit on the goat side, but a lot of the things that we'll be talking about, I'll share both some data from both goats and sheep. So I want to start off tonight just giving you a quick overview. As a veterinarian, during my practice years, I recognized the importance of nutrition and recognized also that the pregnant animal was really the most important animal on the farm because she had the greatest potential impact on farm profitability relative to her success or failure to transition from a pregnant state into the lactating state. So we're going to focus a bit on the gestation nutrition, and then take that and put that in perspective with how that fits in with probably the single most important disease that we have in our small ruminants, which is pregnancy toxemia. And then we'll focus on pregnancy toxemia prevention through good nutrition. And then we'll move into our next topic on colostrum quality and getting that colostrum into the kid or the lamb to ensure adequate passive transfer and protection from a wide range of diseases. As I just said, to me, the pregnant animal is really the animal we need to put some focus on in the feeding program, using sort of the witticisms that the UCLA coach John Wooden used to kind of inform his students. And he said, you know, failing to prepare for the basketball game is preparing to fail. And I think that kind of perspective is very appropriate when it comes to thinking about this whole process. We've looked at this, and I've worked in this area on the dairy cattle side for most of my career, but now applying these concepts to our small ruminants, and it certainly is appropriate. So one of the things we want to focus on, that two of our topics tonight are looking at the metabolic disease perspectives of failing to prepare, and then also the colostral supply and quality aspects. But we also know that if we're not feeding this late pregnant animal correctly, we may see large or small, weak neonates that have high postnatal losses. We also may see poor milk yield, which may translate into poor lamb or kid growth. So there's many aspects of the profitability of the small ruminant farm that really have a pivot point right at this period, this late lactation or late gestation, early lactation period. So the big question then is, why is late pregnancy so important? What this graphic shows, if we take a look at this, this is looking at the days from mating of the female relative to the total fetal weight. All right, so this is just the fetuses, what the birth weights would be. And the graphic shows data for singles where you're just a little above 7, and then you can see as we go from singles to twins to triplets to quads. And so this is a fairly significant change going from this point to this point here. And if we look at what we call the area under these curves, from about day 100 to day 150 of gestation, that last third of gestation, this accounts for 60 to 70% of that total fetal growth. So if you look at all the area under the curve, this point here, out here, that area is basically 2/3 of what this kid or lamb is going to grow in utero. And so if we compromise nutrition during this period here, what mom is going to do is she's going to take that compromise on her own and compromise her metabolic capacities because she wants to and is directed to keep those fetuses alive. And that's the real key. I'll explain that relationship a little bit more detail, but that's really the key, is mom is going to sacrifice herself to try and keep her fetuses alive. Now, this end of gestation, one of the big problems is we see this very high requirement relative to the rapid growth. But we know that at this late gestation period, dry matter intake or food consumption in our sheep and goat is really at quite a low point. And that's the real conundrum here, is we have this basically exponential growth of the fetus causing dramatic linear increases in requirements for nutrients for mom, but mom's intake starts to go down. And that's the critical factor we need to focus on in terms of understanding how to prevent this disease through good nutrition. So let's start at the beginning and look at the nutrient requirements. What do we know? All right. So when I talk to my students in class, we start with these problems, and we first have to recognize, what do we know and understand? Because once we know something, we can measure it, then we're able to manage it. And so what I want to show here in this graphic is I went into the National Research Council, that's this NRC. They published a report in 2007, which provides us a guidebook for the nutrient requirements for all small ruminants. So they have tables and all kinds of information relative to sheep requirements, goat requirements, llama and alpaca requirements, and then cervid, the farm deer. So what I'm doing here in this is I'm just going to show you the main nutrients. We want to look at dry matter intake. We want to know how much this animal can eat or what she's supposed to eat. That's the important point. ME stands for metabolizable energy. So this is how much energy she needs to keep her body and support the pregnancy. And then CP is crude protein. So this is the amino acids that the animal needs to consume to, again, maintain her body as well as support that growing fetus. Now, what I did on the bottom here is I'm going to compare requirements for these three components across what we call different physiologic states. We'll start with the maintenance animal. So this would be the doe or the ewe after she's weaned the lamb or kid off, and she's not pregnant. She's just kind of hanging around for a bit before she's getting ready to go through the breeding process again. So that's our maintenance animal. Maintenance, as you'll see, is the lowest requirements. Then we'll move into the early gestation period. This is characterized as the first and second trimester, so the first 100 days, 90 to 100 days. Then late gestation, where there's only a single fetus. Late gestation, where there's twins. This is that last 100 day or 50 days we talked about. And then lactation with a single or lactation with twins. So these bars are going to show up and give you some visual perspective on the requirements. Over here, this is going to give you the numbers for dry matter intake and metabolizable energy. And then on this scale is the crude protein scale. So here we go. The yellow bars represent dry matter intake. And this should be no surprise that a maintenance animal consumes or is expected to consume the smallest amount of feed, whereas an animal, a doe that is lactating with twins, is going to consume the largest amount of feed. Okay. And then you can see there's a little bit up and down here, and we'll explain that, but we'll highlight these two here in a moment. Now, the red bars are going to show us the energy. And again, you see sort of this progressive increase. But then notice that the energy requirement for late gestation in twins is actually greater than the energy requirement for lactation with a single. And then, of course, the energy requirement for lactation with twins is the greatest. And then the green bar now is going to show us the crude protein requirement. So here we need 101 grams of crude protein. Here in early gestation, 143, and then you can see 206, 233, 239. So you can see these two are very close, and then a massive increase here when you have twins. So the important things to see here is notice that there are some variations in dry matter intake, and they're not consistent with whether or not they have high or low requirements. And so to try and give you a little better perspective here, what I did is I calculated using the dry matter intake and what the requirement is, either protein or energy. I calculated what the density, what the concentration of energy measured as total digestible nutrients. This is something very commonly seen on our forage report. That's why I did it this way. And then our crude protein. So you can see here that the maintenance doe only needs about 6.6% crude protein in her diet, total diet, and an energy density based on TDN, total digestible nutrients, of about 52.8. You can see the energy density in early gestation really doesn't change, but there is a slight increase in protein requirement. When we move to late gestation, again, notice our energy requirement really doesn't differ. We have a slightly greater protein requirement. But then look at this. We go from a 52.8 TDN, all of a sudden we jump to 66.3% TDN and 12.5% crude protein. And this is for that late gestation girl with twins. Now, what if she's got triplets or quads or quints? That's going to even increase these numbers more and probably decrease the dry matter intake, as I'll explain in a bit, lower, which means the concentration here is really going to get great. And this is where pregnancy toxemia comes in, is we're not meeting this requirement for our late pregnant animals. Now, notice that for an early or for lactation with a single kid, the protein and the energy is actually lower than what it is for the late gestation. And that's because you'll notice the big difference in dry matter intake. So we can have a more dilute diet. And then you'll even notice that the energy and protein for lactation, a doe lactating with twins, is really not much different in protein, but lower than what the energy density is. And again, it's because of this greater increase in dry matter intake. Now, one of the concerns I have in looking at the NRC requirement, we can see here what I've highlighted, that for the goat data, the NRC committee, I think, is right on in that they recognize the late pregnant doe can't eat as much because of the number of fetuses and the space that they take up in the abdomen of the doe. Whereas the single, it's not a big problem. So you notice that there's a drop in dry matter intake here. And I think that fits with observations out in the field. In contrast, in the sheep data, if I was going to show you the same exact kind of graph, but for the NRC for sheep, they don't show this drop in dry matter intake. And I think that is wrong. And that really brings in some issues in terms of feeding this late pregnant animal and meeting the needs of this animal according to the numbers that the NRC has. All right, so this is the basis that we're starting on, is we have an idea of what kind of nutrient density and content we need to meet the nutritional needs of the animal. Now, we know, since goats and sheep are ruminant animals, and from a feed cost perspective, forage should be the predominant source of nutrients in the diet of the sheep or goat. But we also know that forage can vary quite tremendously depending on when it's harvested and what kind of forage it is. So I want to demonstrate some of those concepts with this graphic here. You can see down at the bottom, we have, let me get my pointer here, grasses and legumes. And then you'll notice that the drawings of the plants show the growing plant. So this is just to represent how the plant grows and matures. So plants go through the same kind of what we might describe as physiologic phases that, animals do. You have a newborn baby, and then they go into puberty and become reproductively active, and then they become geriatric. That's the same exact thing plants do. All right. And so we use different terminology. So like the newborn plant is considered leafy. All right. So highly vegetative type plant. This is a highly digestible plant. You could see the leaves, the percent leaves, the protein, crude protein, and the minerals are at a high level. All right. So if we look at this going from low, medium to high in terms of relative quality, so we can see this very early plant. This would be that lush spring pasture you put them out on in April, May, depending on where you are in the country. And then we get into the early reproductive, let's say the beginning puberty stage of the plant, where the seed head is just starting to develop. In grasses, we call this the boot stage, where the seed head is starting to come out, and in legumes, the pre-bud stage. And then we get into the reproductively active stage, where you have the head, the full head of the grass showing, and the bud showing on the legumes. And notice what's happening with these lines. They're dropping down as the plant matures. And notice that these two lines are increasing. And what those lines represent is the amount of fiber in the plant and the percent stems that are in the plant. Then we get into the reproductively spent or geriatric plant, and we can see it's got very low concentration of these important nutrients and highly digestible nutrients, but very high in fiber and stems. All right, so we do know that the way these plants mature and develop is dependent upon the day length, the ambient temperature, fertilization, moisture availability. And this then dictates the quality of the plant at different times throughout the year and comparing the same time from one year to the next. I hear many small ruminant clients say, well, I don't need to do feed analysis because I get feed from the same guy who grows the hay from the same fields year in and year out. And my response to that is, wow, that must be a really wonderful place that the day length, the temperature, the moisture in that region is exactly the same year to year. And then they sit there and they go, oh, right. So that's, this is really changes. This is where we get into the discussions of first cutting versus second cutting versus third cutting or fourth cutting. And then, was 2021 a good year or 2022 a good year? Was our spring cold and wet, or was it sunny and very warm? And that's going to impact how fast the plant progresses through this process. Now, ideally, when we look at feeding the nutrients, the digestible nutrients of the plant to our animals, the plants that are in these two stages are the optimum stages that we would like to harvest the forage at to have the maximal amount of digestible organic matter or nutrient content. Either end here, the other ends of this, this is highly digestible, but the yield is very low. And this is poorly digestible, but the yield is very high. So if you don't raise your own forage and you purchase forage from a hay grower, more than likely they're pushing it out to this end because they're going to get more tons per acre. They're going to get more bales of hay per acre, and then that's going to make them more money. But for you as the purchaser of that forage, your animals aren't going to get as much out of that, and you're going to have to be moving a lot more manure. Now let's come back and put these into numbers so we can then compare to our requirements. So what I've done here is I've given the range or values for the total digestible nutrients like we had before, the crude protein, and now I'm giving you a measure of neutral detergent fiber. So the fiber component here, we typically measure as neutral detergent fiber, and this controls dry matter intake. Remember, dry matter intake is that really important point that we're focusing on. So this plant right here, whether it's a grass or a legume, you could see if it's alfalfa, the TDN is greater than 64%. The grasses are a little bit less energy dense, so they're going to be greater than 54%. But you can see the protein is greater than 19 or 18. And the NDF, alfalfa has lower NDF, less than 40, and grass is less than 55. As we move into this middle group, which is where we're kind of targeting, you can see the TDN for our legumes is between 56 and 60, where the grasses are between 47 and 54. The crude protein is between 17 and 19. Notice the grasses now drop a bit here. And then we see a slightly higher NDF and slightly higher NDF. And then we can see another drop in the TDN, the crude protein, and the NDF. So this forage here is going to be a better forage for your maintenance or early gestation, whereas this forage over here is going to be better for your lactating and late pregnant animals. But the problem is we always don't have two different types of forage. And so we have to make up for that difference with feeding grains, whether we have to feed soybeans or corn or barley or oats or something like that. But then let's look at this last group over here. You can see it has the lowest TDN, very low TDN for the grasses, very low proteins, and very high NDF. Now, you probably don't remember those numbers I showed you before, so let me overlay the numbers here. So remember the maintenance doe, she has a 52.8% TDN value and a 6.6% crude protein. So she could probably get away with a mature grass from a protein standpoint, but she's still going to need some energy because she doesn't have the TDN in this grass. But if we move up to our late gestation doe, where she needs 12.5% crude protein, this isn't going to do it at all. Maybe a late bloom alfalfa, but remember her concentration of energy is 66%, and that's higher than anything over here. So that tells us that we absolutely, positively have to feed some kind of grain to meet the energy needs of our late pregnant sheep and does. And if we don't do that, we're setting them up to fail by having pregnancy toxemia. Okay. Now, I want to come back to this fiber issue. This was an absolutely fascinating. Sure.
We had a question that I think relates to your previous slide. We had a question about how silage compares to dry hay.
The nutrient content, it's a good question. The question being silage versus dry hay. These numbers that you see are independent of the type of forage, the harvest method. So you can harvest hay at these different points, at different maturities, And the same thing with silage. You can harvest at different maturities. Now, the only difference is the silage has to be a bit wetter. We're not going to dry it down as much as we would for the hay. So we could have silage that's in this stage. We could have silage that's in this stage here. And we also can have silage in this stage here. So does that make sense? Okay. That clear up that? All right. So let's come back to this fiber issue. This is a study that was done by Dr. Forbes back in the late 60s. And what he did, this was an interesting study, is he took sheep that were pregnant at different stages, and they euthanized the sheep, they froze them, and then they sliced the sheep at different levels of the spine to look at the relationship between the rumen, this is the R here, and the uterus. And this is all relative to how the uterus increases in size in the abdomen and prevents the rumen from being able to manage and take in enough forage. So let me start here. This A is a sheep at 88 days of gestation with a single fetus. And so we can see the rumen versus the uterus. Then we move over to here, and this is a sheep at 111 days. So this is right into that last trimester with a single fetus. And we can see how this rumen, remember, this is all these sections that are taken at the same level of the spine. So we're not moving upwards or downwards, anterior or posterior on the animal. It's at the same level of the spine. And you can just see the size difference in the rumen, and what's happening is this enlarging uterus. Then C down here is at 143 days of gestation in a sheep with a single fetus. And again, we can see this rumen decreasing in size and this uterus increasing. Now, this concept does apply to cattle, but cattle have a large enough abdomen that this isn't as significant. Plus, cattle generally don't have more than one fetus. You know, we might have twins every now and then, or a triplet every 10,000 births, but our sheep and goats are basically litter species. And with incorporating, genotypes such as fins and polypays in our sheep breeds, we can increase the number of lambs in the litter. And in this final diagram is a sheep at 95 days, so somewhere between A and B, somewhere between here and here, but with twins. And so this rumen is sort of in between these two with the twins. So the point here is there's a physical limitation to how much fiber a sheep or a goat, a pregnant sheep or goat. And again, more important when they have twins, triplets, and quads than necessarily singles. Now, how does this translate into numbers that we might be able to use and manage? This is an older study performed in 1983 at the Grassland Research Institute over in the UK. And they fed basically a silage. You can see it was 24, a pretty wet silage, almost 25% dry matter, but it was nearly 19% crude protein and 48.5% neutral detergent fiber. And they fed a little bit of grain on top of this for the ewes. This was a sheep study. And so here, what I'm showing you, they didn't do these calculations, but they did provide intake for the animals, the composition of the diet, and then whether the animals had singles, twins, or triplets based on ultrasound or post lambing analysis. Here are the last few weeks of pregnancy. So 15 weeks on up to 20 weeks. All right, so this would be 140 days, 133 days and on down. And so what I did is I took the total dry matter intake reported in this study, the analysis of the silage, and calculated neutral detergent intake as a percent of the live body weight of the ewes. This is a parameter that we're using in dairy cattle to get a sense of how much fiber they can consume. And this work was done by somebody you guys may be at least familiar with, Dr. Dave Mertens. He worked at USDA lab there in Wisconsin for a number of years. And his original PhD work was looking at fiber intake capacity in our ruminant species. And he worked with cattle as well as sheep. And for a lactating animal or a dry, non-lactating, non-pregnant animal, NDF intake was approximately 1.2% of body weight. So if we had a 200-pound ewe, it's a big one, but if we had a 200-pound ewe, she could eat basically 2.4 pounds of neutral detergent fiber on a daily basis. So what I did is I did these calculations, and what you can see is these numbers don't even come close to 1.2% of body weight. So this tells us this fits with what Dr. Jack Forbes told us in the previous slide, that they can't eat as much fiber because they just don't have the space for that fiber to sit in their rumen. But what I want to point out here is if you look at these numbers, the girls with a single fetus, they start in the mid 0.8%, and then they may drop to 0.7. You can see the overall mean in this last part of pregnancy is around 0.76. But when you look at twins, they start just slightly lower, but they end up much lower down here. And again, the average here is only 0.68. And then when you look at triplets, they start at a much lower and drop to even a much lower value here. And then if you look at this across the ways, you could see 0.8, 0.81, 0.74, and you can see that there's a decline. So this is really an important concept, and this is what dictates the quality of forage that we need to feed to our does or to our late pregnant ewes. Otherwise, we could restrict their intake, put them in the negative energy balance, and lead to pregnancy toxemia. Okay, so let's come back to those numbers that I showed you earlier. So I made this a complex chart, but this gives us the final big picture here. Here is our mature doe. She's 70 kilograms, that's 154 pounds, late pregnancy with twins. So the NRC table would tell us, if we look this up in the table, that she should consume 4.12 pounds, and that's the same as what we saw in that graphic. She needs 4.48 megacals of energy. I calculated based on 0.8% of body weight, she would need to consume a little over a pound of NDF, 560 grams. There's 454 grams per pound. So this is going to be about 1.2 pounds of intake of NDF. She needs 233 grams of crude protein, like we showed before, 6.6 grams of calcium, and 4 grams of phosphorus. Now, if we assume this intake level, 4.12 pounds, that's equivalent to 2.7% of their body weight. And then this is the energy density, the NDF content of the diet, then the crude protein content that would be recommended, the calcium and the phosphorus content. Okay, so this is based on what the NRC panel says, what a late pregnant doe that weighs 70 kilograms with twins, she needs, or she should be able to consume and do this. Now, if you read that table closely, this is based on feeding a fair amount of grain. Now, a lot of people may not feed because of grain costs, may not feed that much grain. Now, the other thing is if the NDF, as I said earlier, is higher in that forage, a more mature forage, she can't consume this and she's not going to be able to get to this level. So that's what this lower part of the graphic is. And so here I am saying, okay, she's not able to eat 4.12 pounds of dry matter. She could only eat 3.85 pounds or 2.5% of her body weight rather than 2.7. If that's the case, we still need to meet these numbers up here. And so I take this number and instead of dividing it by this number, I divide it by this number. And now you can see I need a more energy dense diet. I also have a slightly higher overall NDF, although it's the same amount of NDF. And you notice that now the protein goes from 12.5% to 13.3%. Now, what if we have some other issues going on and the animal is only eating 2.3% of her body weight, which is not atypical? And look what happens. Now we're having to feed about a 14.5% crude protein diet for our late pregnant doe, not the 12.5%. We need to remember our animals do not eat percents. We only use percents to characterize and communicate what kind of diet, because you're not going to have any sense if I say that doe has, her diet should be 233 grams of crude protein. You don't have any idea what that really means. But if I say 12.5% crude protein, you have a better perspective there. Now, there was one study done in the 80s in pregnant does, and they fed 3 different levels of crude protein. They fed about an 8 to 9%, a 12%, and a 14%. And when you look at that data, even though they suggest 12% was adequate, when you look at the rest of the data that they had in that study, it looked like the 14%, because those animals ate less than what this number was. So my take-home point here, something I really want you to focus on and think about, is we have good numbers on the absolute amount of these nutrients that our goats need or our sheep need, but the dietary composition is dependent on the intake level that our goats are achieving. And for various reasons, weather conditions, feed availability, competition at the feed bunk, all of these things that could influence water availability, that can influence dry matter intake, that may reduce that dry matter intake, which means we need to put more protein, more energy, more calcium, more phosphorus into that diet so that we still meet their needs. If we don't, then we're prone to leading this animal, we're preparing her to fail because we're not meeting her needs and she may go into pregnancy toxemia. So
can we ask a question that came through the chat?
Yes.
Yes. So we had a question that related to the NRC. How would you calculate requirements for the dwarf breed goats, which, as we know, are a little bit different size-wise? Is that something that's provided in there, or is that something you have to calculate?
No, the NRC tables body weight of animals, maintenance animals, runs from 10 kilograms or 22 pounds on up to about 90 kilograms or just over 200 and some pounds. So it does span the full spectrum of body size for the various breeds of goats. Now, how accurate they are and how much data we have on the dwarf breeds of goats, that's another whole issue. That's a completely different issue. But the NRC, using the models that they have at hand, do provide appropriate, or at least what we think are appropriate numbers for the various breeds based on body size. Okay. So I'm showing you two different forages, Forage A and Forage B. And what I'm interested in is, by your visual perspective, which forage do you think is the better forage that you would want to feed your late pregnant doe or your late pregnant sheep? All right, we're gathering up the data here. They both look green. They both look like they have a fair amount of leaf to them. All right. This one is a little more close up picture than this one here, so that might be a bit different. All right, so it looks like the majority are looking at A as their choice, and so that's that's a good option. So let me show you the results now. And my point here is, you can't always judge just through visual. This is how I'm going to try and convince you that it is worth the money to get some feed analysis done. You have a world-class lab in Wisconsin, the Dairyland lab and Rock River lab. So those two labs are really world-class labs. All right, so get rid of this. So let's look at the results. I have the feed analysis on both of these. So take one last look. You should notice a little bit of a seed head here, which gives you a little bit of a clue as what we're going to see. So let's, I can get my computer to work. There we go. All right, now what I want to do is I want to get my highlighter so we can start. So this is how I look at feed analysis. So remember that we always have to look on a dry matter basis. All right, that's how we compare feeds. But the first thing I look at is, what is the dry matter? All right, so this is a hay, and a hay should have less than 15% moisture. So this should be no less than 85%. If it's anything higher than 15%, there's a higher risk of molding and heating and so on. Now, if you're doing large round bales, you could probably go to about 20%, 25%. And if you're doing silage, you're going to be in the 40% range of moisture. All right, so then the next thing after I look at moisture, I look at protein. So here we're at 12.4% crude protein. That's pretty darn good for a grass, all right? And then we can look at our fiber. I can divide this number by this number, and that gives me a value of approximately 0.66. So this tells me that this is predominantly a grass. If the ADF divided by the NDF is less than 0.7, it's mostly a grass. If it's up around 0.8, it's a legume. Now, the other thing we see here is the non-fiber carbohydrates. This is the sugar content. This is a very good number, and that translates in a very nice TDN. So here we see the TDN is 64%. Remember that chart that I showed you, 64% TDN for a grass is like an early vegetative grass. Well, that's because the NDF is only 43%, all right? We also have a decent calcium content, phosphorus content, magnesium content, and these other numbers also look pretty good. So this is actually a grass that's in what we would call somewhere between the early vegetative to the early boot or boot stage. Now, let's come to the other side. Here we have another hay. We see it's only got 9% moisture, so this is nice dry hay. That's appropriate. But oh my God, look, 6.9% crude protein. This is half the protein on a density basis as what we would need for the pregnant doe. This would cause pregnancy toxemia. This would cause massive muscle loss and a lot of other problems. We notice the ADF is higher, the NDF is higher, the carbohydrates are lower, the TDN is just slightly lower. We have a little bit lower calcium. We're too low on the phosphorus. We're low on the magnesium. So this would be a forage that we would really have to provide a lot of supplemental feed. If we use the 0.8% and divide 0.8 by this 43.6, a doe could eat about 1.8% of her body weight as this forage. But this forage with 58% NDF, she could only eat 1.3% of her body weight. So this is really going to reduce, not only because of the lower density of nutrients in the forage, but we can't eat as much of it. And so if you feed her a traditional pound and a half of grain for late pregnancy, she's still not going to get all what she needs because of this poorer quality forage.
So we had a question come in the chat. Is the timing of feed analysis important for baled hay right after harvest versus sampling 3 months into storage?
It depends on how the storage, the quality of storage. If your hay is exposed to the elements and gets rained upon, then you're going to want to test it at that point, because a lot of the water soluble nutrients are going to leach out of it. But if it's under a roof and off the ground, then the analysis when you harvest it is going to be very close to what it is in storage. Okay. So now I want to get into the pregnancy toxemia topic. We kind of set everything up. So what is pregnancy toxemia? Well, it goes by the various different names: pregnancy ketosis, twin kid disease, or just ketosis. But what it is pregnancy toxemia is what we call a metabolic disease that occurs during late pregnancy when the ewe or the doe is unable to maintain blood glucose, right? So glucose is the energy currency of the body. Everything that the body does, any kind of activity, any kind of work requires energy, and that energy comes from the animal burning glucose as a fuel source. So when we don't maintain blood glucose, this puts us in what's called a negative energy balance situation. And so if the ewe is not able to maintain her glucose status and her energy, she's going to mobilize body fat to make up that difference. And so depending on how much fat she mobilizes, that could have ramifications in the disease process itself. So pregnancy toxemia, as we've already alluded to, most often associated with does with multiple fetuses. But we also know that any kind of stress factors like severe weather, sudden feed changes, transportation, social grouping changes, these can cause stress in that animal. And it turns out that the stress hormone results in mobilization of body fat, and that can start us down this pathway. Now, a complication here is pregnancy toxemia is identified as a disease based on blood and urinary ketone concentrations and low blood glucose. So those are the hallmark diagnostic keys that we have. But low blood calcium, often called milk fever, can suppress dry matter intake, suppress mobility, and suppress the animal from eating. And so calcium problems can kind of interact with the potential for the pregnancy toxemia issue. All right, so this isn't the nicest terminology to use when we think about a developing fetus, but how I think you can maybe get a good perspective of the problems that we have and why we have problems with pregnancy toxemia is we need to think about that fetus or fetuses. They're in some ways defining a parasite. So if you look at this graphic that I provided here, the placenta supports the fetus, and the fetal placental unit lives off of nutrients that are supplied by mom's blood. All right. And so if you look at this yellow box here, this accounts for what the fetus and placenta consume out of mom's blood. The fetal placental unit consumes between 35 and 50% of her oxygen, 45 to 50% of her glucose, and 72% of her circulating amino acids. Now, the placenta itself, which is basically a waste product once the fetus is born, it itself consumes 30 to 50% of this oxygen supply. So it's consuming a third to a half of the total oxygen that is taken in. It's consuming 2/3 of the glucose, but only 24% of the amino acids. So if you compare the blue box to the yellow box, you could see that the fetus relies more on amino acids. And that's important because from mom's blood, she provides glucose, lactate, and amino acids. These are the main things that can cross the placenta and be used by the fetus. And as a result, glucose and lactate are passed only if mom's concentration is high. In contrast, independent of mom's protein status, she will always transport amino acids because that's going to keep that fetus going. So that's why I think, the proper perspective to understand the challenges, the metabolic challenges here, is thinking of this fetal placental unit as a parasite. It's going to eat all the protein that mom can give it. And remember, mom has no reserve protein. Every protein in her body has a function. She's got reserve fat for energy, but you notice fat doesn't cross the placenta, and that's because of the thickness of the placenta. And so diet is so important in providing these nutrients. Now, if we take a look at the, again, looking at the growth, this is the full conceptus weight. So I showed you a graphic earlier that is the weight of the fetus itself, but this is the weight of the fetus, the uterus, and the conceptus. And this is for a single fetus, this is for twin fetuses, and then triplets. And this is based on some sheep data. But if I then put in the body weight of the ewe or doe, you can see that for triplets, this at the end here, this conceptus weight accounts for 28% of mom's body weight, 21% for twins, and only 11% for singles. You get much above 20%. And that really puts mom in a precarious situation to be able to provide enough nutrients and maintain her body size or body weight. Okay, so let's now look more closely at pregnancy toxemia. This is a video of a Boer goat that is in pregnancy toxemia. You would think from the look here that she's got respiratory disease, but the classic things of pregnancy toxemia is stocking up in the legs and this breathing pattern. She's big and pregnant. And what's happening is this dam is losing the protein to the fetus so that she's leaking fluids into her legs, into the distal parts, and into her lungs. And that's why she's breathing so hard. Now, there are two ways that this comes about. The overconditioned pregnant ewe or doe goes into negative energy balance, And this is highly associated with a secondary disease called hepatic lipidosis, which means fatty liver. And when the liver starts to go, then it's basically a one-way trip to goat or ewe heaven. All right. Another way of pregnancy toxemia coming about is where you have moderate to thin pregnant ewes or does that are underfed energy and protein. So there's what we call starvation ketosis, and that is probably the bigger problem that I see. Now, both methods of getting into pregnancy toxemia have in common that they have high ketone levels and low blood glucose. And then calcium deficiency, as I said earlier, can predispose or exacerbate this negative energy balance and problems. So how do you decide if your ewe or your doe is at risk? Well, one risk factor is being overconditioned. So if they're carrying too much body condition going into pregnancy, they're at a really high risk for ketosis because the fatty animal or a fatter animal will have a reduction in dry matter intake. And that puts that puts us into that precarious situation of not having enough nutrients in the smaller package of feed. These does or ewes are at high risk for fatty liver, and we typically see this in our show animals that are just overfed grains. And here's that other risk factor, the undercondition. You can see this is a very thin ewe. So if they're going into pregnancy in this thin condition, you couple that with poor quality forage like we described, low protein in the diet, they're at really high risk for starvation ketosis. A third factor is the feed availability. So you can see this picture here, these does eating their feed, but notice that this cement barrier here, you can look at the arc that these does have to put their neck into to get any feed. So they're not going to be able to eat as well. And then if they're overcrowded and things, so sufficient bunk space, can they all eat at the same time, which they want to do? Is there sufficient amounts of feed? So this is the feeding management aspect. And waterers, you should have at least 2 waterers in each group so that a dominant boss doe or ewe doesn't control the water. And then finally, another big risk is parasite control. If you don't have the parasites under control, parasites are going to rob nutrients, also potentially decrease dry matter intake, and then this leads to a greater risk for pregnancy toxemia. Now, pregnancy toxemia is not an on or off disease. It's a progressive disease. So we describe it in 3 stages. The first stage is where the doe or the ewe is weak. She separates herself from others. She's got a slightly decreased appetite. She may be more reluctant to come up and eat. She struggles maybe to get up a little bit. Legs have some swelling or what we call edema in them. And again, this is due to a lower protein. These kind of animals, we can, if we use targeted supplementation, providing some propylene glycol, maybe adding a little bit more grain in their diet, depending on how they are, we might be able to salvage these animals and get a live dam and live offspring. Stage 2 is progressed. The ewe and doe really is not willing to eat unless coaxed. She's only able to get up with some help and support. She may start to show some early signs of neurologic problems, head pressing. She may appear blind, start to do some stargazing and things like that. This is a more challenging. We need to use aggressive supplementation if we're going to save the offspring, the fetuses, and the dam. The third stage is when the doe or ewe is in the final throes of the disease. They can't get up even with assistance. They're not going to eat at all. They'll have labored breathing. They'll be depressed. They don't respond to any stimuli. And basically the fetuses are either really close to death or they're already dead. the only way you're going to salvage the ewe or doe in this case is do cesarean section or extremely aggressive, very expensive interventions at a veterinary teaching hospital or something. So you never really want to go to stage 3.
Are there any known genetic links to pregnancy toxemia at this time?
Not that I'm aware of, other than animals that are prone to larger litter sizes, and then older animals. So as the animal ages, she's more prone. So you want to be cautious in keeping some of those old girls around, especially if they're going to have, or if they've historically had twins, triplets, and so on. Okay, so how do we recognize this? Our goal is to recognize it early. So changes in behavior that I described, not wanting to eat, not coming up the feed bunk, lack of appetite, not moving around well, swelling in the legs. And if you're lucky enough, some people have the right nerve connections that they can actually smell the ketones on the breath of the animal. It smells. It's acetone that you smell. So, like fingernail type polish. What we typically do is we identify ketones in the blood or the urine. So we can use a dipstick like this, stick it in some collected urine. And if it turns this dark purple color, that's high ketones and probably a high risk. The other thing we're starting to do is blood glucose concentrations. And so one thing that we are doing now is these handheld meters that people use for testing their blood glucose if you're a diabetic. We have validated, I'll show you some of the data that we've generated and others have, where you can use these test strips. If you can take a blood sample right on the farm, use these strips, you got to set the equipment up right, but it's really not that hard to do. And you just put a drop of blood on there and you can get a good handle on the analysis. So there's the test strip. It shows you how to just insert that into the meter. All right. And many of you, if you're testing your glucose, and again, for sheep and goats, for dairy cattle, we only use the ketone test strip, but for sheep and goats, I would recommend using both the ketone and the glucose, because at least our data would tell us that we need both of those diagnostically. All right, and then you'll see a number come up here. This is counting down, and then the number comes up, and that's the number you would read and use. Now, how do we, here's the data. We can find a very tight correlation or association on ketones and on glucose between what we measure on the meter and what the lab would tell us if we sent the blood sample to the lab. So this tells us that we can use these handheld meters on the farm to help diagnose pregnancy toxemia. Now, there is this one goat study out of Canada where they looked at the beta hydroxybutyrate. This is the ketone that those meters measure. And you can see here, this line represents as this beta hydroxybutyrate increases as the animal gets closer to the day of kidding, which is day 0 here, she has a greater risk of becoming pregnancy toxic. And then this is also looking at ketones relative to day of kidding or week before kidding, and whether or not she's going to survive the process. So this is a mortality risk. And you can see numbers above 1 are significant. And why I mention that is your dairy veterinarians are going to think 1 is not a big issue. All right, because we have sheep and goats are much more sensitive to the ketone effects than what our dairy cattle are. So the real quick breather here. I see I'm really starting to run out of time. I'll go ahead and start in on the colostrum, and then we'll come back and gather up some of the questions. So moving into our next topic. Basically, just like in our dairy cattle, high quality colostrum is really the single best method to minimize the disease problems and promote the health of the kid and the lamb. The problem is, do we really know what high quality colostrum is for a sheep or a goat? Do we just use the dairy cattle information? So why is colostrum so important? Well, colostrum is that very first milk that is secreted into the mammary gland prior to the time of kidding or lambing. Once that dam kids or lambs, her mammary gland, her udder starts making regular milk, which means it dilutes the colostrum. So timing is critical for good quality colostrum. Now, when we think about colostrum and compare it to milk, colostrum generally has higher fat, higher protein because of the immunoglobulins. These are the antibodies that mom is transferring to the fetus. And then colostrum also has higher concentrations of macro minerals and trace minerals, very, very high in vitamins. This is a very important source of vitamins. And then also, fresh colostrum is going to have immune cells from mom and growth factors from mom that can help the fetus and upregulate the fetus's immune response. And so that's one of the advantages of fresh colostrum. So when it comes to colostrum in sheep and goats, what do we really need to know? Well, as I said, we need to know what the adequate colostrum IgG concentration is. And then can we do this on the farm so that we can manage colostrum? And to determine the adequate, we really need to have data relative to what's fed and do the kids survive and are they healthy? The other question is, are there breed differences? Is colostrum from a dairy breed the same as colostrum from a meat breed? And then the final question is, what's the adequate amount of colostral IgG that gets into the kid or the lamb's blood? And then how do we assess that? Can we use total protein like we do in calves? What total IgG mass, how many grams of IgG is needed? And are there any different effects of feeding method of colostrum? So when I looked into the literature, there are very little studies that characterize the quality of colostrum in goats and especially in sheep. There was only one study I found in sheep. But if you look at these numbers here, 47, 10, 4 to 65, 47, 54, 7, 6 to 65. These numbers are all over the board. To give you a point of reference here, our goal in dairy cattle is to have 50. All right, so 50 would be the number here, but you can see goats are either below or above that. So the question is, what really is the important? This was an interesting study. This was from Switzerland, and I put the red line in here to represent the dairy cow recommendation of 50 milligrams per ml of immunoglobulin. And then if you look at these graphics, these represent the range of IgG concentration in various goat breeds. So this very first one is from the Boer goat, and you can see it's a lot higher than what the dairy one is. This is the Nubian, this is a Saun, this is a Toggenburg, and then some other unusual breeds out of Switzerland. But if you look at the top here, all of these breeds here, which are predominantly milk breeds, are very different and lower than meat breeds. And so this is what we see, just similar to beef cattle versus dairy cattle. Beef cattle have a much more concentrated IgG colostrum than dairy cows, and it's because of the dilution effect. This is sheep colostrum. And again, what we see is here are a wide range of sheep. You can see the 50 mark here. A lot of the sheep are below this, but then here's our two dairy sheep breeds, the Lacune and the East Frisian breed, and they are significantly lower than these meat breeds here. So in both sheep and goats, we see a big difference in IgG concentration between meat breeds versus dairy breeds. Now, similar to what we see in dairy cattle, the concentration of immunoglobulin and colostrum drops precipitously in the first few milkings. You can see very dramatic declines in this. So this is, again, the timing effect. We also see this with some other measures. This is some data that Dr. Mary Smith at Cornell shared with me. But you can see in just 4 hours, there was a dramatic decline in the concentration, and then going from kidding to 22 hours. So how can we measure colostrum on the farm? Well, in dairy cattle, we have a colostrometer, but this isn't very appropriate for our small ruminants because you need a large volume of colostrum. So the other option is whether or not we could use what's called the refractometer. This is a digital Brix refractometer, and then this is an optical refractometer. And so the digital Brix, what you can do is you just put a drop of colostrum in this area here on this drop of glass. You close the flap. You set the menu so that you're doing Brix refractometer, and then it comes up with a reading. All right, so that's a nice, simple way of doing it. The question is this appropriate for goats or sheep? So I'll show you our data that we've generated so far. This graphic is for goats, and sure enough, there's a nice relationship between the Brix value and the IgG concentration in goat colostrum, and also a similar but not as strong relationship with sheep colostrum Brix versus the colostral IgG. Now, what I want to show is the 50, which is that dairy cow one. Goat colostrum measures differently with Brix than what dairy cattle is. And I think it's due to the difference in the fat globules in goat milk versus cattle milk. In contrast, the sheep show a very similar relationship between Brix and IgG concentration as cattle. And so this sort of reinforces that effect. Now, here's the data that we found. If you remember the graphic I showed you earlier, the goat data was all over the board, as low as 4 and as high as 75. Our goat data, we had a IgG concentration of 71. All right, the average there, the median value was 74. You can see the range was 4.2 to 180. So there's a wide variation in goat colostrum. The Brix value averaged about 21. And this would be, this is higher than what cow colostrum would be. But notice for the sheep data, it's even higher. We're up at almost 95. You can see the median value was 80, but again, a huge range, 0.55 on up to 297. So colostrum is highly variable in our small ruminants. All this goat data was taken from one farm, and all the sheep data was taken from one farm. So this shows you that even on the same farm, there's a lot of variation. And so that's why it's important to be measuring this. All right, to try and finish up here, looking at how well the kid or lamb absorbs that immunoglobulin. For our kids, we were able to get a concentration of about 15.8. What we try to achieve in cattle is 10. So again, this reflects the higher concentration of immunoglobulin in goats. And you could see the total IgG that our kids consumed on average was about 35 grams. And that's an important number for us to remember. Now, we didn't have all the data on the sheep, but we had similar concentrations of serum protein and IgG between the sheep and the goats. When we look at the relationship, we have established that we can measure total protein in blood as a proxy for evaluating the serum IgG concentration in both goats and in sheep. Although the sheep, it's not as strong. We have more data to work on there. But let me get into the final couple slides here. How do we put all of this information now into practice? So when we think about colostrum feeding, our recommendations for goat kids is about 1 ounce per pound of body weight within the first 2 hours. And we'd like to achieve a minimum of 10 to 15% and preferably 20% of body weight total colostrum volume. So now the methods, I think we have a quick poll question that we can do. How do you feed colostrum? To see what you're doing. All right, we're collecting that data. So certainly the predominance is on direct nursing of the dam. All right. And then about a similar third for bottle feeding and tube feeding. All right. So that's good. What we found in our data was there was no difference in IgG concentration depending on the method of feeding. So that's an encouraging thing. Now, our data in goats suggested that we needed to get about 35 grams of IgG into the goat kid. This is in contrast to we usually shoot for about 200, 250 grams into a calf. This brings up the use of colostrum, commercial colostrum products. You know, if you're worried about CAE in goats and you're not feeding colostrum from the dam because you CAE positive, you're probably using some kind of colostrum supplement. So commercially, there are colostrum replacers and colostrum supplements. So I think we have another quick poll here to take a look at. Are you using a commercial colostrum replacer supplement, or you're not using commercial product? You're just using the natural colostrum. All right, numbers are coming in. So far, it seems that no commercial colostrum product is being used in just over half. About 9% of you are using a supplement, and about 38, almost 40% of you are using a replacer. Okay. All right. Now I want to bring this up to finish the talk off so we can get into some questions. This is a colostrum product that is commercially available. This is the analysis that is provided. Here's the recommendations. You take 1 packet of material, you mix it with 7 ounces of warm water, you let it cool a little bit, and then you feed it. So here it's 2 ounces if you're using it as a replacer, or 1 ounce if you're using it as a supplement. The first thing I want you to remember is all of these supplements, the IgG in these products are bovine. There is no commercial product with goat IgG or sheep IgG. So that's not the perfect scenario, okay? The other problem we have is when I do the calculations, This product here has 65 grams of globulin protein per pound. So that's basically 4 grams per ounce of IgG. And then you're supposed to feed 2 ounces per 4 pounds of body weight. So that's 8 grams per 4 pounds, or 2 grams of IgG per pound. So that if you have an 8-pound birth weight for your kid, you would be administering 16 grams. Well, what did I say our data was showing? We needed to feed 35 grams to this size kid to achieve the blood IgG concentration that we were able to achieve. So the bottom line is these products, they're a Band-Aid for a situation. And again, if you're trying to manage your way through a CAE, it's really the only options you have, but you need to realize that these things are very limited. And there is one study that shows that. Here's a study where they fed natural colostrum or a colostrum product. They fed it at different rates, either 3 or 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And what I've highlighted is the higher level of 3 for the colostrum in red and 3 for the commercial product in blue. And then here's that 15 milligram per ml that we achieved in our study. And you can see only at 12 hours did they achieve this, and they drop off very rapidly. So commercial colostrum replacers just are not going to do the same job. If you have problems raising your kids, your lambs, and you're using commercial supplements, boy, you better start thinking in other directions in terms of what you need to do. All right, so take-home points here relative to pregnancy toxemia is a common disease in late pregnant goats and sheep that have multiple fetuses. We need to identify those does or ewes with the multiples to help feed them differently to meet their needs. Hypocalcemia or low blood calcium is a complicating process to pregnancy toxemia. Can make things really bad. And the big problem with calcium is making sure there's enough calcium in the diet. Late pregnant diets need to be properly formulated to meet the energy and protein needs of the ewe or doe based on intake, right? That's important. And what we really need to do is assess forage quality and then supplement appropriately to the forage. And so we want to look at NDF intake and be in that 0.8%. We need to provide some glucose precursors, which is coming from sugars and starches. So that's your cereal grains. And we may want to increase that protein to somewhere between 13 and 17% for these late pregnant multiple girls. And we're not going to get into it too much, but supplement vitamins A, D, and E so that the colostrum is high in these vitamins for the newborn. The take-home points on the colostrum: the Brix refractometer can be accurately used to evaluate the IgG concentration in goat colostrum as well as sheep colostrum, similar to dairy cattle. On the goat side, we're suggesting about 35 grams of IgG in 2 feedings to achieve the serum concentration of 15 as a minimum value. We want to have the serum protein above 6 to ensure that we've met that 15 milligram mark. And we certainly need a lot more research to establish the true necessary amount of IgG that needs to be in the serum of the kid or the lamb that promotes good health and minimizes disease. So with that, I know I'm running a bit late, but I'm more than happy to stick around and answer some questions. And thanks for listening in here.
Okay, yeah, if you are willing to stick around a little bit longer, we did have some additional questions come through the chat. I'm trying to scroll up to try to grab some of the ones that we kind of swung past. Maybe we'll start at the bottom and work our way up. We had a question Do I feed colostrum replacer or supplement as the first feeding if needed? I've read one is better, but can't remember which.
Say that one more time.
So the question's revolving around feeding a colostrum replacer or supplement, trying to figure out which order or which is your let me try this again. Do you feed a colostrum replacer or supplement as the first feeding if needed? And there was a little bit of a question about which one is better. They couldn't remember which was more important.
All right, so a colostrum replacer is going to have a higher concentration or higher total amount of IgG. So if this is the first feeding, you want to maximize the IgG, because once you start to get that kid or that lamb to absorb IgG, the gut starts to close down and the efficiency of absorption really drops like a rock. So it's really important. That's why we say within 2 hours, you want to get that first big gulp of colostrum and a lot of IgG in at that point. And then you can continue to feed it, but just realize that the absorption efficiency is going to be greatly reduced.
Thank you. We had a question about, can a doe or ewe have hypocalcemia but not toxemia, or do they tend to always run together?
They generally run together because once they get into toxemia, they stop eating. And then once they stop eating, they're going to go into hypocalcemia. But if you're not providing sufficient calcium in the diet for the late pregnant animal, they're going to go hypocalcemic because they're losing all kinds of calcium to the fetal bones. And so unlike dairy cows, where we want to feed a low calcium diet during pregnancy to ensure that the calcium system is working properly when they calve, it's the opposite in our small ruminants. We want to feed calcium to meet the calcium needs. Otherwise, they're going to go hypocalcemic. They go hypocalcemic, they're not going to eat, their GI tract shuts down, and then they'll become toxemic.
We had a question about somebody that has a pregnant doe with CAE, and they're concerned about colostrum for their kids this coming April. Is it better to utilize a replacer, or if they have the option to pasteurize the doe's milk?
Ideally, I would pasteurize the colostrum because, again, as I discussed, the replacer is bovine origin IgG, so it's not going to last as long in the lamb or the kid. There are recommendations on heat treating. I believe we're looking at 60 degrees Celsius for about 60 minutes, not like a regular pasteurization. You don't want to make colostrum pudding, but you can kill the CAE virus with heat treatment of colostrum.
Okay, we had a question about a ewe that has prolonged labor. What do you do? Say if the ewe, maybe lamb's okay, but can't get up to clean off and stand for nursing. What's the process look like to manage that?
Well, the first thing I would look at is if that ewe is slow to get up, more than likely hypocalcemia is going to be playing a role in that process, because remember, calcium is necessary for muscle contraction. So if you look at that ewe where she is, you don't see any pellets behind her, you don't see any wet spot where she's urinated. So in other words, she's not urinated, not defecated. That's a really strong sign that she's hypocalcemic. And so then, if you work with your veterinarian, you can get a bottle of 23% borogluconate, calcium borogluconate solution, and you can inject about anywhere between 25 and 50 milliliters under the skin, and that would help her with that.
Okay. We had a question about someone has a overly conditioned show doe that's 95 days along in pregnancy. What feeding strategies are out there to reduce her chances of toxemia? What does that look like?
Yeah, so that's going to be a challenging one. We've had that kind of circumstance in our dairy cows that were overfed, what we used to call fat cow syndrome. So we probably have a similar fat doe, fat ewe syndrome. My success in those is feeding a higher protein in the late pregnancy period. So I'd be pushing the protein in the diet upwards of about no less than 15% crude protein in the total diet, and even approaching 17%. Make sure that you have the energy going into that ewe or doe. The quality of forage needs to be really good to keep her eating. The problem is with these overly fat animals, as I said, when they're over conditioned, that shuts off their appetite center, and so they're not likely to eat, so their dry matter intake is going to be greatly reduced. And so you're going to have to feed a fairly nutrient dense diet, which seems contrary given that they're already fat, but the problem is their total intake is so reduced that we don't want to underfeed them, because then they're going to mobilize that body fat and go into fatty liver disease, and that's basically a one-way trip.
Mm-hmm. We also had a couple of questions come in about the testing strips that you were mentioning for ketones and glucose. And one of the questions was, is there a kind of an optimal time prior to lambing or kidding to test for ketone or glucose levels? And then the second question is, are you able to get those test strips yourself, or do you have to have a vet involved to be able to source that?
My understanding from the company is they are routinely available. So they should be, at least the CentraVet. I'm trying to remember what company sells those, but they should be available. You don't need a vet prescription per se. I mean, it would be useful to have your vet involved so that you're all on the same page. In terms of the timing, that goat study that I showed would suggest that starting at about 4 weeks prior to expected kidding or lambing, you're going to want to watch these does or ewes fairly closely. And if you start to see one showing some of these signs that we talked about, then that would be the animal you would want to test and see, because the higher the higher the beta hydroxybutyrate, the higher the ketone, and the lower the glucose, the further away from lambing or kidding, the greater the risk, and also the greater the consequences and the severity of the disease.
Mm-hmm. Back to talking about the colostrum supplements or replacer products, do we know of anyone working on a goat or ewe specific product, or is it just not cost effective enough for companies to be pursuing that at this time?
There's not a good mechanism how these products are being made. They're pretty much made out in Alberta, Canada, and they have a large population of cows that they hyperimmunize and then collect the colostrum. And so there just isn't any real interest in doing one for sheep or goats at this time, unfortunately.
Okay. We had another question about getting into a specific kind of scenario, but second parity doe that's eating well, but tends to lay around a lot and has swelling of feet and legs due soon. They don't know the exact date, just wondering, what strategies they should maybe be looking at.
So again, watching them close, making sure that they have feed. If they're not getting up and moving around, you might want to, second parity, typically not as big of a problem on the calcium side, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out. It all depends on what the calcium content of the diet would be, but that would be something I'd look at closely. And then looking at the nutrient density of the diet, it's very easy, as I showed with those two feed analyses, to really be underfeeding when you're not thinking you're underfeeding, and any kind of low level of protein in the diet. Remember, protein is being preferentially provided to the fetus irrespective of mom's status. And so that means mom's going to start mobilizing her blood proteins. And then that's why they start to stock up and things. That means they're in a low protein status already. And if they're got some parasites along with that, that makes it even worse. So I'd be checking parasite levels and, looking at the diet and maybe thinking about getting some extra protein into that diet and some extra energy.
Okay, and I think we're going to wrap this up with just a follow-up to the question about the doe that was a little bit on the heavier side, and your suggestion of feeding the higher protein diet. Is that something they should be starting to do immediately just to get ahead of things, or?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't want to delay on these things.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we are going to let our guest speaker go because he is actually an hour ahead of us. So we do want to thank him for his time. Really appreciate it, especially knowing that we went so late. Really appreciate you being able to come out and talk to us about this topic today.
Yep, no problem.
All right. Thank you. Well, that I think concludes our presentation. I think Carolyn had a couple of last comments.
Yes, sure. Thank you for that great presentation. And if anyone has continuing thoughts or questions, please feel free to reach out to Alyssa or myself, and we can get in contact with Dr. Van Saun at another time and finish this conversation. And don't forget to register and join us next month for our Weathering the Ups and Downs with the UW-Madison Sheep Operation Enterprise Budget. So bring some numbers and your pencil and your not your calculator, because the budget tool is going to do that, but bring some numbers and we'll get to looking at the profitability of your operation. So thank you very much.